Tonight, restored. All data has been recovered from a cyber attack in Fort St. John. Vandalized. The Fort St. John Women's Center is hit. And snowfall warning. Up to 10 centimeters expected in the South Peace. Well, good evening and thank you for joining us. And we begin tonight in Fort St. John, where city officials are confirming all data stolen in a recent cyber attack has been restored. The breach crippling phone lines, emails, and much of the city's internal network. Back on February the 25th, an unauthorized third party gained access to part of the city's network and encrypted data. The city confirming that data had been stolen. This breach has also wreaked havoc on city services, leaving cybersecurity experts grappling with the aftermath. The city is still working with authorities to review findings and determine if any sensitive personal information had been stolen. Their investigation remains ongoing, and they have to remain sensitive about exactly what information is being released. Since the cyber incident response was launched, over 95% of front-facing services have now been restored. The My City portal for bills online has yet to be restored. The Fort St. John Women's Resource Center are the latest victims of vandalism. The nonprofit now asking for the public's help in identifying 3 suspects who destroyed a sign in front of their building. The incident occurring on March 7th, just before midnight. A video posted to Facebook, as you can see, shows 3 individuals walking down 96th Avenue. One of the perpetrators then kicks and plows through the sign, displaying the logo and phone number before jumping on it. Another suspect then drives himself into a pile of garbage beside the sign before the trio walks away. The Resource Center now calling the act vandalism, disheartening as it came at the start of International Women's Day. They also say this isn't the first time something like this has happened. They add the cost to repair the sign takes away resources for client services. A case file has been opened with the RCMP. Anyone with security camera footage from that night is being asked to come forward in order to identify the suspects. The District of Humbler Ridge has announced the candidates for the upcoming by-election. The vote was triggered after Ken Klikach, who's been in office since 2022, resigned back on January the 20th. The district now revealing the list of candidates in the running: David Thompson, Donald McPherson, Keith Bertrand, and Natasha Doherty, all looking to win a seat on council. Advanced voting taking place on April the 2nd and then on the 9th. As for the by-election itself, that'll be held on April the 12th. Those interested in being election officers have until March the 14th to apply on the district's website. Another cold snap leading the city of Dawson Creek to reactivate its emergency warming center. The Nawakan Friendship Center opening its doors today to those looking for relief from the cold. It'll be available around the clock until Saturday night. Refreshments will be made available at the site located on 102nd Avenue. It comes on the heels of Environment Canada issuing a snowfall warning for Peace River South. The weather agency says snowfall amounts of up to 10 centimeters are expected, as wind chills near -22 overnight into tomorrow morning. We'll have more on this latest blast of winter coming up a bit later on in weather. BC's River Forecast Center providing an update on snowpack levels here in Northeast BC. The snowpack in the Peace region currently sitting at 79% of normal. That's a slight drop from the 83% in February. As for the Fort Nelson and the surrounding Laird region, the snowpack as of March 1st is 98% of normal, and that's a 10% decrease from the previous month. The BC River Forecast says, as far as the ongoing drought situation, these numbers are relatively healthy. However, it's the rain this spring that'll be the main factor in alleviating drought conditions here in the Northeast. The average snowpack for the province sitting at 73%. That's a 1% increase from the previous month. As part of the escalating trade war with the United States, the BC government is taking aim at American-trained doctors and nurses. The province is fast-tracking the process for American family doctors to come work in British Columbia. Now, this would reduce the wait times from 8 months down to 6 weeks while removing barriers, including the requirement to write an exam. The doctors would still have to be certified by the American Board of Medical Specialties.
Over the last few weeks, we've seen more U.S. doctors and nurses expressing interest to come here to Canada to work. And with the uncertainty and chaos that's happening down south of the border, it certainly doesn't come as a surprise. This provides an opportunity for BC to send a clear message to doctors and nurses who are working in the U.S. Now is the time to come to British Columbia.
Now, the province is also launching an ad campaign using posters to recruit U.S.-trained doctors and nurses to BC. Now, the streamlining of the system is expected to kick in about a month's time, not a moment too soon for the 700,000 British Columbians who remain without a family doctor. Efforts to modernize the Columbia River Treaty between Canada and the U.S. are now on hold. It comes among rising trade tensions between the two countries.
We believe, and I'll tell you, we have an agreement in principle with the United States. It's the basis for a treaty, and we're going to defend our interests every single day. And no amount of bluster is going to change that.
The U.S. administration has paused negotiations with Canada on an amended Columbia River Treaty. The Americans saying they're conducting a broad review of their international engagement. The Columbia River Treaty regulates everything from flood control and power generation to water supply and salmon restoration. In a highly anticipated move, the Bank of Canada has reduced its interest rate to the lowest level since 2022. As Judy Trin reports, the trade war with the States will likely slow the pace of Canada's economic growth while increasing inflation.
With its latest interest rate cut, the Bank of Canada warns the trade war launched by the United States will push Canadians into troubling territory.
We are now facing a new crisis. Depending on the extent and duration of new U.S. tariffs, the economic impact could be severe.
The central bank is trying to keep inflation down by announcing an interest rate cut of 25 basis points to 2.75%. That's the seventh consecutive drop in a year. The cuts are meant to encourage spending, but costs are expected to rise with tariffs as supplies that Canadian companies need from the U.S. will become more expensive.
A trade war is a supply shock. It's going to disrupt supply chains. It's going to affect production costs and production capacities.
Last month, the bank surveyed hundreds of Canadians. It found that many companies had lowered their sales projections and were considering layoffs. Nearly half of the businesses planned to increase their prices, while customers were planning to spend less. Workers in mining, manufacturing, and the oil and gas industry felt most vulnerable.
Monetary policy cannot offset the impacts of a trade war. We're going to get weaker economic activity. We're going to get higher prices, higher inflation.
Unless the U.S. drops or limits its protectionist measures, economic growth could stagnate.
A 1% shock to GDP would pretty much put us in a crawling position and thus a recession. So it's definitely we're waiting to see how the economic data comes in.
In this trade war, the Bank of Canada is implying that fiscal policy matters more. Controlling inflation will depend on what politicians decide to cut and where they decide to spend. Judy Trin, CTV News, Ottawa.
So, who will blink first? That's the question being asked tonight as Canada sends a message to Donald Trump. Ottawa responded today by slapping reciprocal tariffs, a dollar-for-dollar hit on nearly $30 billion worth of American imports. This after Trump punched first with a 25% tax on aluminum and steel at 12:01 a.m. this morning. The tariffs apply to steel and aluminum coming to the U.S. from all over the world, no exceptions, and it also includes derivatives, all products made with these metals, which is a big deal. Mike Lecouture has the details.
The federal government is warning Canadians this will be a day-to-day fight as it responds to tariffs from the Trump administration. Now, today's dollar-for-dollar response comes as key Canadian ministers are set to meet their counterparts in the next 2 days.
It is going to be maximum pressure and efficient diplomacy.
The pressure comes in the form of $29.8 billion worth of tariffs on American products. The diplomacy will be in meetings with U.S. officials tomorrow in D.C. and Charlevoix, Quebec.
These continued tariff measures and the necessary and appropriate response that comes from Canada is not a constructive path to be on. If you're like racing to the basement there's no real prize for being the first person to get to the basement.
Canadian ministers are meeting with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick tomorrow, hoping to remove all tariffs in advance of the April 2nd deadline. The meeting was sparked by a call from Lutnick yesterday after Ontario Premier Doug Ford imposed 25% export tariffs on electricity going to the U.S. Ford walked back that threat and will be part of those meetings in Washington.
Let's stop this. It's going to hurt both economies. It's American people that are going to get hurt. Canadians are going to get hurt.
But President Donald Trump continues to see it as a one-way problem.
Canada's absolutely one of the worst. And we, when I say worst in terms of charging tariffs.
In a show of support for workers, Prime Minister-designate Mark Carney visited a steel plant in Hamilton. He's promised proceeds from tariffs will go towards people in the affected industries. Carney is also committed to heading to the White House.
I'm ready to sit down with President Trump at the appropriate time under a position where there's respect for Canadian sovereignty, and we're working for a common approach, a much more comprehensive approach for trade.
But that won't happen until he's sworn in as Prime Minister, which a spokesperson for Carney says they hope will happen by the end of this week. Mike Lecouteur, CTV News, Ottawa.
And Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum imports have drawn swift retaliation from across the Atlantic.
Jobs are at stake, prices up, nobody needs that. On both sides, we are responding with countermeasures worth 26 billion euros.
The European Union announcing what it calls proportionate levies on certain American products like beef and bourbon. And Trump vowed to counter those measures with more tariffs of his own. The United Kingdom has yet to weigh in on retaliatory tariffs, while Australia says it will not take any countermeasures. China has already imposed tariffs on some U.S. goods. And as we mentioned earlier on, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister says she will speak to the U.S. Secretary of State about tariffs during this week's G7 Foreign Ministers meeting in Quebec. Another major focus of the talks will be a possible 30-day ceasefire deal between Ukraine and Russia. Kyiv supports the U.S. proposal, saying it would allow time to plan an end to the war that would include security guarantees. The Americans insist it's now up to Moscow to make a decision. CTV's Jeremy Charon has more now on the meeting that officially gets underway tomorrow.
The message from the U.S. Secretary of State is he won't be bringing up taking over our country. But Marco Rubio will be hard-pressed to avoid facing questions about what President Donald Trump has said about annexing Canada. Ahead of tomorrow's G7 Foreign Ministers Summit here in Charlevoix, where Rubio's attendance has quickly become a focal point, especially for Canada, the Secretary of State says he'll talk about shared interests and not annexing our country.
That's what the meeting is about. It is not a meeting about how we're going to take over Canada.
But he did reiterate Donald Trump's notion that Canada would be better off as a 51st state.
He says if they became the 51st state, we wouldn't have to worry about the border and fentanyl coming across because now we would be able to manage that. He's made an argument that it's their interest to do so. Obviously, the Canadians don't agree, apparently.
Canadian sovereignty and identity are non-negotiable. Canadians have had enough, and we are a strong country. We will defend our sovereignty, we'll defend our jobs, and we'll defend our way of living.
Now, that could make for some tough talk here tomorrow morning when Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly hosts a bilateral meeting with Rubio, where I'm told tariffs and U.S.-Canada relations will be top of the agenda. As for the larger agenda here in Charlevoix, issues relating to the geopolitical landscape will be top priority, including the situation in the Middle East and the Russia-Ukraine war. The U.S. Secretary of State is coming off a positive meeting with his Ukrainian counterparts. Jeremy Charon, CTV News, Charlevoix, Quebec.
Now, the city of Fort St. John announcing a joint documentary film project with the Treaty 8 Tribal Association. The spirit of Treaty 8 will be highlighting the history and significance of the treaty. It was signed back on June the 21st, 1899, and the film will mark its 125th anniversary. The 40-minute documentary will feature stories, cultural events, and interviews with First Nations and community leaders. It's funded by Heritage Canada. The project is led by the Treaty 8 Tribal Association with support from the city. The filming will span 2 years with screenings and digital access planned once it's complete. And it's being produced by Indigenous-owned production company InnoNative. The Treaty 8 Tribal Association represents 6 First Nations, including Fort Nelson and Doig River across Northeast BC. All right, please stay tuned. I'll be right back with weather, but as we head to break, a look at today's closing market numbers.